It is my pleasure to introduce to you this morning Sierra Fox, who you've already heard during our service.
Yeah.
Sierra is a third-year cantorial student at Hebrew Union College with a background in classical music and interfaith outreach. She was born and raised in the Philadelphia area, so she is a native Pennsylvanian. She has sung with a vast number of both sacred and secular choirs as a mezzo-soprano soloist and choral alto, while also touring throughout the United States, Europe, and South America. And she is looking forward to fully applying her experiences to her studies and vocations as a future cantor. Sarah currently serves as the student cantor at Temple Emanuel, in addition to providing cantoral and educational support at Congregation Beth Yom in Hilton Head, South Carolina, East End Temple in Manhattan, and Reformed Congregation Knesset Israel in Elkins Park, PA, where she started her path to the cantorate. Recent musical engagements include a solo presentation at Israel Art Song, classic to contemporary, alto soloist in Bernstein's Chichester Psalms at the International Cantors Assembly, and for all Adler's 5 Sephardic choruses at the Kimmel Center, as a part of her annual engagement with the Sing Hallelujah concerts of Jewish music. She received her Bachelor's of Music in Voice Performance and Religion and Society from Syracuse University, followed by graduate study in Voice Performance at Temple University, and works towards a Master's in Social Work at Widener University. She looks forward to her graduation with a master's degree in sacred music and her ordination as a cantor for the Debbie Friedman School of Sacred Music, Hebrew Union College, the Jewish Institute of Religion, in 2024 and 2025, respectively. Please excuse me if I killed the names of So it is my pleasure to introduce to us Sierra. Sierra.
Thank you so much. When I sent in my bio, I did not think I would be putting you through having to read it out loud. Having to put myself through hearing it read out loud, it's a, oh boy.
I wanted to make sure that they really understood your major background.
Well, I appreciate it so much, and I'm so honored to be here and so happy to see so many faces here. And to those of you online, thank you for joining, and those of you who might see afterwards, we're sorry you can't be here. So I would love for this to be a space where you feel perfectly free to ask any questions you might have about anything related to anything I'm talking about. I can't promise I'll have all of the answers, because in Judaism we generally acknowledge that we always have more questions than answers. But the asking of questions is, I think, very sacred and holy, and I would be honored to engage in that holiness with you. So a little bit about the background of the cantor, a cantorate, because the word cantor has meant a lot of different things to different religious traditions. Currently, in Reform and mostly conservative Jewish congregations, a cantor is an ordained member of clergy, so very similar to the rabbi, but with a focus on music. The term cantor is, what we use in a kind of Latinate way of referring to this, but in Hebrew we call it a chazan. It's a little tricky because Hebrew is gendered and chazan is a masculine word, and there isn't really a feminine word for it. So sometimes we try to feminize it by calling it a chazanit, but that kind of sounds like a little, it's like, it doesn't really, most of us don't use that term, and there is a tradition of female cantors of sorts, but they would really be singing outside of the synagogue for many, many years, even in the Orthodox communities. And those were called the chazantas. So that was a feminine term, but also doesn't really apply now. So we're still trying to figure out where we fit into this world of Jewish music and leadership. And in American Reform Judaism, we just use the word cantor most of the time. And some of us who are female will still use the word chazan, even though it is a masculine word. So let's talk a little bit about just Jewish music and kind of how these things were set up a long time ago. In like the time of the Second Temple, so around like 70 CE, there had been a lot of choirs, a lot of singers among the Levites, among that kind of priestly sect. And after the destruction of the temple, those choirs just went by the wayside. But because we lost the temple, we lost the ability to make sacrifices, we tried to figure out what to do to replace that. And what we did was create this fixed liturgy and prayers. This is where we start to see prayer structures that are more similar to what we use now in our synagogues. And this shift required some amount of literacy in the liturgy, in the prayers. And those who weren't trained in that in Jewish communities, among the Israelites, among the Hebrews, weren't really able to engage in it without a trained leader. And so they had these leaders that they would call shlichei tzibur. It's kind of emissaries of the congregation. And we still refer to ourselves as like a shliach tzibur, shlichat tzibur. But it was, a kind of Rabbi Cantor combo. You would just be leading, you would do some singing, you would do some talking, you would just get people through the prayers. Then in around the 7th century, the Shlichei Tzibor were trained to really sing these prayers as well, and not just like the text of Torah, not just the very specific liturgy, but then also these piyutim, these kind of like poetic prayers that were written by sages and important folk throughout time. And so this is where we really start to see the development of the chazanim, the cantors of old in around the 7th century.
Can I ask?
Absolutely.
What was the liturgical practice in the temple?
So the temple, it's a big question. The temple was a place for sacrifice, largely. And so the priests were trained to engage in these sacrifices in meaningful ways. They would take care of the animal sacrifices, the grain offerings, the sin offerings. There were all different types of sacrifices that were demanded for different reasons and at different times in the Jewish year.
But nothing like a service?
It was a service in a sense. It was a service of sacrifice, and we see echoes of it in our liturgy today. But there are echoes that are farther and farther from what we do now. The service of Musaf, for example, is maybe more related to those kinds of sacrificial practices, and it's a service that we almost never do in Reform tradition. We'll very rarely see a Musaf service. We learn about them vaguely in school, but we don't really utilize them in our services. But yes, because it was so sacrifice related too, the priests were the ones who were really trained to do these sacrifices, and they were monolithically aware of what was happening. And there was a lot of pageantry, and we actually were just finishing up the book of Exodus in our Torah cycle right now, and this whole end of Exodus is all about like how the priests kind of engage in these rituals with the Mishkan, the tabernacle, holding the tablets of the commandments. And there are all sorts of like fancy things they're supposed to wear, and how are they, we gotta put some blood here and do this, and it's and no temple, none of that, which is interesting because it's coming out of a tradition that was nomadic in and of itself with a moving tabernacle. So, I don't know, interesting. But as a lifelong vegetarian, I'm okay with no sacrifice. So. We don't need that anymore. It's fine. But yeah, does that answer your question
Yes,
more
yes,
or less?
thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Any other questions before I continue? That is precisely, thank you for modeling the perfect way to ask questions. Please, anytime you have something, I'm happy to jump into it. So just moving forward, like zoom, way forward in this, let's talk about kind of the 17th to 19th century, where we start seeing the development of like the kind of famous chazanim, the superstar cantors of the golden age and all of that, and the introduction of choral music and organ into the synagogue. This is something that was really divisive among synagogues, and as someone who spent a long time working in churches, I am like, oh yes, give me more organ, like I love it. And it was something that was considered very churchy by a lot of synagogues. It wasn't inherently a church instrument.
By churchy, you mean Christian?
Yeah, that it was something that belonged to the church. You would only find an organ in a church. But a lot of synagogues found themselves really craving that largeness of sound. It's so, there are a lot of arguments by famous Jewish musicians and composers saying, there is no other instrument that is so effective at reining in the masses and helping them stay aligned together so we can sing really together. This is all a little tricky because there is a lot of argument in Jewish tradition about the use of instruments at all, not in the synagogue, but specifically on Shabbat. So Shabbat being our day of rest, there are incredible lists of prohibitions, the things that we are not supposed to do, the things that count as work. So these are decisions that were made a long time ago, and so the question is, how are they applied as times change? So for example, if you are not allowed to kindle fire on Shabbat, because that's considered work, are you allowed to flip a light switch? The rabbis say, no, you're not. So no light switches. If you want the lights on, you gotta turn the lights on before Shabbat and leave them on. Are you allowed to press a button on an elevator? No. Are you allowed to drive a car? No. That said, as I mentioned before, I'm a Reformed Jew.
Yeah, I was going to say, how much is this true for Reformed Jews?
Reformed Judaism has basically the main tenet that what we are responsible for is informed choice. So we should learn as much as we can about historical practices, about the practices of other denominations, and figure out what makes sense for us in terms of how we feel a connection to our community and a sense of the divine. And I say that recognizing that there are Reformed Jews who don't even like to talk about a recognition of the divine. That's not language that works for them. For them, it's a matter of community and identity as a part of a tribe. I'm someone who likes talking about God. That's language that works for me. And it's language that's in our prayers a lot, so that's convenient. But part of what the Jewish tradition is finding new interpretations and engaging with the text in new and meaningful and personal ways as times change. We recognize that as much as we value the written text of our Torah, we also have oral Torah that is just as important. And that it is our job to dive into this text, to ask questions, to come up with new understandings, to argue about it, and allow that to grow and change, and that itself is sacred as well.
The version of the Lord's, the 23rd Psalm that the rabbi read today, I thought was really interesting. What was that from?
No, I don't know. I had never heard that. I'd heard. I'll drop him a text later. I loved it, but I'm not sure what that translation was from. But that speaks to precisely this point that there are so many interpretations of these things, and I know for me, I like to now go in sometimes and make my own translations of the prayers and the liturgy. Like, how does this make sense to me? I'll jump forward a little bit in this because this applies here, but one of the most important prayers we have in our Jewish tradition is called the Shema. Shema means listen or hear. We call this the watchword of our faith. If you ever walk into Jewish spaces and they have the little things on the side of the doors, the mezuzah, inside the mezuzah there will be a copy of the Shema. And it's a whole set of liturgy, but the main phrase of it that we refer to as the Shema is Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And literally this means, hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. And that's fine. I like that. But it doesn't spark anything inside my heart. And I was participating in some virtual prayer in 2020 with a friend who interpreted this prayer as, listen, O God wrestlers, the divine is in everything, the many are one. And that, I mean, I get chills every time I say it. That worked for me. And it makes sense. You know, Shema, listen, Yisrael, Israel, the name that Jacob received when he wrestled with the angel, or the Ish, the man, the God, who we're not sure. There's all sorts of debate about that, but we are considered a people who wrestle with God. Hear, listen, O God wrestlers. Adonai Eloheinu, we talk about this, Eloheinu, our God, but this divinity is ours, it's within us. And then Adonai Echad, this multiplicity is itself one, Echad. Oh, that works for me. And it's not a literal translation, and it might not work for everyone, but because I now have that interpretation, I have a closeness to this prayer. And when I sing Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, I feel God, and I feel that oneness, and I feel a part of it. And it's just, that's a real gift that we have. And I wouldn't be surprised if the end of that interpretation of the Lord's Prayer was at least maybe in part written by Rabbi Aaron himself. Like, he's always coming up with incredible interpretations of the liturgy and of our Torah. But yeah, you know, the Hebrew that we have has so much flexibility to it. And when we get into some of the Jewish mysticism elements of things, like Kabbalah, they feel that not only does every sentence have meaning, every word has meaning, every letter has meaning, every sound has meaning, and you can pick apart every little piece of sound that comes into every letter of every word and find new meaning in that there are countless secrets hidden inside every noise that we make of prayer. So there's endless stuff to pull out of all of this. So. Yeah. So diving back into instruments and halakha, the Jewish law, halakha. So the rabbis say you're not allowed to work on Shabbat, or you're allowed to play an instrument on Shabbat. So here's where it gets tricky. You're allowed to sing on Shabbat. So is our body an instrument? So ultimately they say, okay, instruments aren't inherently not allowed on Shabbat. You're allowed to play an instrument. But here's the thing. If something goes wrong with your instrument, you're not allowed to fix it. So if your guitar goes out of tune, you can't tune your guitar. And so what this ended up doing is the rabbis said, they had a rule. They said, put a fence around the Torah. You know, like, you don't want anyone to fall out. Like, imagine you're on a roof. Imagine you're fixing the roof. You know, if you're in a little space, you're not going to just put a fence around like right where you are. You're going to give a wider space so that you can do what you need to do, try some things out, and still not fall off the roof. That's the rabbi said. I'm not even making up this example. This is actually like in the Talmud. I don't know. Yeah, they've got all sorts of weird things. And so basically they said, let's not use instruments so that we don't run the risk of having to fix them and breaking the commandment of keeping Shabbat. I love instruments. So I'm a person who feels like my faith is improved by the use of them. There are times where, you know, a nice a cappella moment can be more meaningful, and that's legitimate as well. And in Orthodox synagogues, they generally do not use instruments. But in Reform and conservative ones, we do plenty. So, yeah, some fun stuff about instruments. You're not allowed to tune them.
Is that still true?
Yeah, well, that's why they just don't use instruments, because you wouldn't be able to in
But in
Orthodox.
Reform today,
In Reform, we use instruments all the time.
and you can tune them.
Rabbi Waller had his little guitar.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I played guitar on Friday, and I probably should have retuned it in the middle of the service, but yeah.
So
well,
were there times that like symphonies wouldn't play on Shabbat, or because
Well-
they were made up of a lot of Jewish musicians?
Yeah, if there were Jewish symphony orchestras, they would not play on Shabbat. And there's actually a lot of there's some struggle here in the way in which we live in a country that really does have inherent Christian privilege. We have off for Christmas, we have off for Easter, and we don't have off, for example, for Yom Kippur, which is one of our biggest holidays. And we have prayer all day long, and we fast from sundown to sundown, and it's a really important day. And I was talking to our high school students, for example, and I said, were you able to do anything for Yom Kippur? Were you able to come to services? Did you fast? Did you do service projects? What did you do? And they said, well, I wanted to fast, but I had to go to a soccer practice. And I said, oh, that's kind of messed up that you had to go to soccer practice. And they said, well, theoretically, we're allowed to get out of soccer practice for religious reasons, but we're penalized and we can't participate in the next games.
Oh, dear.
So they're allowed to skip. They have the religious exemption, but if they take it, then they can't. Yeah. And it's not meant to be punitive. It's just well, they weren't at rehearsal. I can't go to the show. So, so this is a thing. Today we don't usually have fully I want to say observant Jewish, but fully Orthodox Jewish symphony orchestras who are scheduling their performances around Shabbat. There are a lot of orchestras that do have Jewish members who then have to decide, what do I do? I've had choirs that I've been a part of that have said, yeah, let's have a rehearsal on the night of, Erev Rosh Hashanah. And sometimes we're able to argue our way out of it and say, look, there are too many of us who are Jewish and this is not appropriate. But sometimes we're too much of a minority and we have to decide, what do we want to do?
When I worked in Baltimore, there was a large Jewish population. So in the public schools, on some of the Jewish holidays, school was closed.
It is in Lebanon, isn't it?
I think when the Pittsburgh Symphony was originally created, they only had performances Fridays and Sundays.
Interesting.
And I
Yeah.
heard years ago that it was for that reason.
I would believe it. It's interesting for me growing up in Philly and then outside of Philly in the Maryland, Delaware area where there were so few Jewish people and I was the token Jew. And now living in Brooklyn where everyone is Jewish. And the other day I was like, oh, I gotta move my car for street cleaning, and I checked my app and it said, oh, you've got another week. I said, what? Street cleaning was canceled for Purim, and I was like, Purim, okay. But we don't expect it, and but yeah, so it's interesting, and that's a real question. It's what are we allowed to do, and how much are we obligated to change with the times and assimilate into a culture that doesn't necessarily have the obligation to make accommodations for the keeping of Shabbat. It's tricky. Our last Torah portion was just right in the midst of talking about the building of the tabernacle and what to do with all of this holy hullabaloo. Talked about how important it is to keep Shabbat. Holy Hullabaloo is definitely my new band name. Wow. Anyway. So any questions about that before I dive into a little bit of weird music
So
theory?
when does Shabbat technically start and when does it end?
Oh, I love this question. So it starts at sundown on Friday, but you want to make sure that like you don't do any like the orthodoxy. I'm speaking from again this Jewish law that we may or may not go by. But theoretically, you want to make sure that you are totally ready for Shabbat. So start a little early, just in case. Make sure your candles are lit. Do all your stuff. Shabbat ends when you can see 3 stars in the sky on Saturday night.
Okay.
And at that point, you can do the ritual of Havdalah, which we've done with members of Bower Hill. And it's Havdalah means separation. And it's separating this holy liminal space of Shabbat from the rest of the week. And so we drink wine to remember the sweetness of Shabbat. We smell spices. We look at a braided candle and we see the reflection of it in our fingernails. We really embody this whole sensory experience, and then we extinguish the candle slowly in the wine and listen to it go. Try to make it as loud and as long as you can, and then acknowledge, all right, we're ready for another week. So we just did that last night. And yeah, theoretically, you're allowed to do Havdalah as late as Tuesday. I don't know, but sometimes you just can't let go of Shabbat. You're like, I need it too much. So yeah, there are arguments about, does Shabbat last that long, or did you just forget to do Havdalah? Yeah,
But what if you can't see the stars?
it's a really good question.
We talked about that last night.
Yeah, I know, it's a bummer. Yeah, I don't know, I guess you're still stuck in Shabbat, can't light any candles. I mean, theoretically, if anyone can see some stars, so like, this was an experience that happened a lot with the holidays. The holidays were based on a lunar cycle. And so when you saw the new moon, you would know, it's time for Rosh Chodesh, Tevet or whatever. And so, but not everyone could see the new moon, and like, whose new moon are we talking about? We want to be aligned. So there would be like, people who would say like, I see the new moon, and like run from town to town, like spreading the news. Oh, we've got a new moon, we've got a new moon. Like, it's time. So even if it was cloudy in one area, hopefully the message would be spreading fast enough that it would get to people. But there are actual practices of like holidays being different lengths of time in Israel, for example, versus in the diaspora, versus in non-Israeli communities, based on how quickly they would be able to find out if the holiday had started yet. So like give them some extra time to catch up. Rosh Hashanah sometimes is celebrated one day, sometimes 2. Passover, which is coming right up, sometimes celebrated an extra day or not. Yeah, some interesting stuff. Yeah. Oh, that's terrifying.
Yeah, are you
I
still
don't
there?
think it's his camera.
Yeah, I am, but it's the trouble I had before, so I'm going to get out.
Oh, we're
no,
sorry.
you can stay. It doesn't bother me. I mean, it is
Can you black your screen?
cursed, I think. But
Just stop your video.
Turn the camera off.
I'll stop my video.
yeah,
There we go.
Perfect. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'd love to talk a little bit about some idiosyncrasies of Jewish music, but we can always jump back to any of this stuff as well. This is just some stuff that I, as like a music theory nerd, get really excited about. So if you're like, wow, this is the most boring thing I've ever heard in my life, please stop me. But so what we find in a lot of Jewish music is the use of what we call cantorial modes. And modes are something that we hear about in Jewish music a lot. We have the Gregorian modes, the plainsong modes that are used in a lot of Gregorian chant that start on like different scale degrees, and so they feel like they're different scales. They don't necessarily have the feeling of a regular major or minor scale that we associate with the normal in Western music. So some of our scales are more common, or let's see, more well-known outside of Jewish tradition than others. We have a scale that's called Magen Avot, which means like shield of our patriarchs. I'm not sure why it's called that, but it's called that, and it's more or less a natural minor scale. So like la ti do re mi fa sol la sol fa mi re do ti la, and we hear a lot of things that are in that scale. Sometimes it'll throw in a little raised leading tone, like la ti do re mi fa sol fa mi re do ti la si la, which feels like again, something we would do in a minor scale more or less today. And we have a lot of music that is in that mode and feels very Jewish. We think about it like, oh, all Jewish music sounds sad and it's all minor, and like it kind of is, but we don't necessarily think about it as sad. But for example, I'm thinking about like our Kol Nidre, which is one of our most important melodies. This is a prayer that we use for Yom Kippur, and it's one of those that is, it's almost problematic because it's less of a prayer than it is like a legal argument. Where basically it's saying, you know, all of the vows, Kol Nidre, that we have made in this past year that we weren't able to uphold. Like, I hereby release myself from them. Or like, God, please release me from them. And, you know, basically recognizing that like we are flawed, we have faults, and that we wanted to do more and we fell short. But here's the time to start again. Please don't write us in a book of death to die in the next year. Yom Kippur is weird. Anyway, this prayer was a problem, for example, for the Reform Jews who were like, I don't know, like, is it really God's place to absolve us of like the debts we have to other people? Like, we have obligations to people, and we can't just be like, well, Kol Nidre, we're done, we're good. So they tried to take it out of the liturgy. And the people were like, nuh-uh, no way, this melody is too important to us. And there are all sorts of stories about this melody being Sinai, like from Sinai. This has been like passed, this was something that was used in the temple. So this is probably not true. But if you tell some Jews that, they'll get very upset because they want to feel like it is something that has come down from forever. And it's, again, a thing that feels primordial. It feels like it's just built into us. And there are a bunch of different variations of it. The one that I use mostly is Kol Nidre Vesare Vachaname Vekoname Vechinuye Vechinuse Ushevut. Of these melodies and motifs that repeat throughout it. There's this Yom Kippurim and it feels like this cry for forgiveness that people just couldn't let go of. And it's the melody that gave us that rather than the text itself. And we find that with a lot of our music, that it's people don't really necessarily know what the words mean. You know, Reformed Judaism is, you know, how many of you speak Latin? Yeah. You know, Hebrew was a dead language for a really long time, and in Israel it has come back to life. But it's not a language that most of us speak fluently. And so a lot of Reformed Jews, especially as that movement was starting, were like, is Hebrew that important? I don't know. But the melodies make us feel connected to a greater community. We also find this in this practice that we call nigunim. A nigun is a wordless melody in Judaism. You'll hear a lot of it. There are all sorts of arguments. We have like brackets sometimes in our nerdy cantorial school classes of like, what are the best syllables to use for nigunim? Is it lie? Is it yai? Die? Bum bitty bum? They're all nai. Anyway, I'm yai lai lai. I'm a yai lai lai gal. But like we'll hear that. Yai lai 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 lai. Yai lai 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 lai. Yai lai 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 lai. Yai lai 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 lai. Yai lai 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 lai. It's nice because if you don't know the words, you can join in, and you don't, and it still evokes something for us. So we might. That, for example, is a nigun that we use sometimes in place of a prayer called L'chun Rananas. We might start with something that's based on nusach, based on these traditional prayer melodies. So, L'chun Ranana, L'Adonai, Nariya, Litzurishenu, Nikadma Fanav, Vitoda, Nariya, Nariya lo, diddy-dai-dai-dai-dai. And then you can all join in on that. The Shliach Tzibor, the leader, the Cantor, the Chazan, might just kind of give you the liturgy at the beginning, and then everyone joins in on Yai Lai Lai. So again, something where the melody is more important than the text. And as a people of the book, that's saying a lot, Do we have any questions? I saw some curious looks. Oh. Yeah.
So these melodies that are so important, do the children learn them? I'm wondering about your attendance and children and coming to, and because I know we struggle with our kids in this day and age that are off running to soccer tournaments, and so how do they learn that, and how does that become an important part of their faith?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll acknowledge that I am not speaking from personal experience with this because where my parents are Jewish, I felt like, oh yes, I'm Jewish, my parents are Jewish, but I never went to Hebrew school and I never became a bat mitzvah. We'll talk about that in a minute. And until I was in my late 20s, my mid to late 20s, I went to Israel and reaffirmed my Jewish identity and took a Hebrew name for the first time. Generally speaking, Jewish families will give their children Hebrew names as babies. They will perform a brit milah and or a bris that may or may not involve some stuff, but this is a ceremony of giving you a name and bringing you into the Jewish community. And then as a child, you would theoretically grow up going to Hebrew school, and so you'll start learning Hebrew enough to at least decode the letters. So you can read your Aleph Bet. And then, once you get into your adolescence, you start preparing for your bar or bat or bet mitzvah. So that is when you are recognized as an adult in the Jewish community. 13 for boys, 12 for girls, which is more recent, that girls were allowed to be brought into the community in that way. I wish I could give you an exact year, and I don't know it. But, yeah. So you grow up experiencing Jewish life and Jewish learning as a child in preparation for this experience where you will lead some prayers and you will chant from the Torah, which is terrifying.
Yeah.
Because
it's incredibly impressive, though.
Oh, it's
when you go to one, these young people, what they
do amazing work, and I work as a B'nai Mitzvah tutor, and it's amazing the way that they're able to bring this in, and it's important that they know that they're not just reciting words, they're also teaching us. So I love that our B'nai Mitzvah is a chance for the students, our children, to give us a sermon. They teach us, they become our teachers in those moments, and it's a good reminder for us, talk about we don't know everything, and there's a lot that we can learn from our children. So that's a beautiful opportunity. But yeah, the kids, so theoretically they're learning some key prayers, some melodies, and how to chant Torah, more or less, or at least how to chant their Torah portion. And now, the thing about the Torah is that it has no vowels and it has a very specific way that you're supposed to chant it, that there are markings that show you how to do that. It also doesn't have that. And also if you drop it, you have to fast for like a really long time. Like your whole community has to fast for years. It's like really bad. Don't drop a Torah scroll, don't put it on the floor. So it's terrifying. You're supposed to like lift it up and show everyone. And, oh boy, anyway, I have some Torah trauma. I've never dropped it, but I will never not be afraid of it. But another way that kids are really getting introduced to the sounds of Jewish music in a very different and modern way is through Jewish summer camp, which is also something that I didn't do, but is so important for our youth. It's really, you know, as I said, like we live in a world that is not usually catering to Jewish needs. And in Jewish summer camp, you spend this whole summer with all Jewish people in Jewish spaces saying Jewish prayers before the meals and Jewish morning services, and like everything is Jewish. And it gives them a real sense of identity and also connection to the music. Now that said, the camp music tradition is its own tradition. Now, we mentioned earlier in my excessively long bio, I'm so sorry, that I'm from the Debbie Friedman School of Sacred Music. Now, Debbie Friedman is an incredible woman, and she passed away 12 years ago, but in her lifetime, she revolutionized the face of Reform Jewish music. She was not a cantor. She did not go to school for music, but she saw a place in modern Jewish music for folk music scene. And it was like, time to make this happen, and just composed prolifically music that is defining of modern Reform Judaism. And she would probably be horrified that any academic institution was named after her, but we're really honored to have her name associated with our school. And so we have a lot of really like fun songs, like Her Mi Chamocha is one of my favorites. Again, got some yai lai lais, because we gotta get the yai lai lais. Yai lai 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 lai, yai lai 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 lai. Yeah, lai. She's got claps in it, and she's always teaching people. She's amazing, and very much also raising up the women of our text. So that Mi Chamocha goes into a song about Miriam, and she's got a song about Devorah. Arise, arise, Devorah, arise, and sing a song. And she's incredible. So there's a place for new music in this as well. I'm going to jump backwards into, I talked about Magen Avot, but there are a couple other modes that are really important. There's Adonai Malach, which is not that exciting. It's more or less a major scale that it's weird. So you're like, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. But then if you keep going up, it's do, re, mi, re, do. It's a flat third, so it's like your 10th is flat, but your third is, anyway. It's strange. Sometimes you have a flat 7th. But the one that I really love is a mode called Ahava Rabbah. In Yiddish, sometimes this is referred to as Fragish. And you'll hear this and you'll be like, oh yeah, that's Jewish. And it's basically, I'm a big fan of using solfege, but it works more or less. If you start on mi, this one works. Mi, fa, si, la, ti, do, re, mi, re, do, ti, la, si, fa, mi. You're like, oh yeah, that's Jewish. That lowered second, raised third. And if you remember also in this morning's Adonai Ro'i, it's not quite Ahava Rabbah, it doesn't have the raised third, but it had that lowered second. So, and there's something about that just evokes this music. Now that said, this is not necessarily an Israeli feature as much as it is an Ashkenazi feature. So really indicative of music growing in this kind of region of Ashkenaz, German kind of, German, Russian music that fed into this style. And then when Israel was founded in the mid-1900s, this became a real question, is what does Israeli music sound like at all? Is there Israeli music? Israel didn't exist. And then it did. And a lot of people felt like we need to distance ourselves from the diaspora, from Ashkenaz. And so they started trying to pull in more Arabic sounds or more like Yemenite sounds and things that felt Oriental. Well, this was the word they used. And so it's interesting that we still, like, basically Ashkenazi music won out anyway. Like, they really tried to get away from that. But we were too tied to those kinds of melodies. But we do have a lot of, for example, Sephardic influence of a more kind of Spanish practice of music that informs a lot of what we have and do. But there's a real, prejudice toward, there's a real preference for, I think, Ashkenazi music among American Reform and Conservative Judaism, to the detriment, I think, of our ability to be inclusive of a broad Jewish musical experience and cultural experience. Yeah. So I'll just talk a little bit about my program in some of our last minutes, because we had some questions about that earlier. So I know I was called a cantor, but I'm not actually a cantor. I'm still in school and I'm not actually allowed to be called a cantor yet, but don't tell anyone. I'll be fine. But so I'm a student cantor, and I am in my third year of a 5-year program. So I still have 2 more years after this one to continue my studies. I go to HUC, Hebrew Union College, which is currently like the ordaining body for Reform cantors. There are other institutions that ordain cantors, but they are either non-denominational or of a different denomination. So our governing body, more or less, is the American Conference of Cantors, and at the end of my program, I will be ordained by them. There was a long time where cantors were, instead of being ordained, they were being invested, and that language change has happened really only in the last few decades. That said, even at that point when we were being invested, we were still invested with the ability to be full clergy. We were performing weddings and funerals. We were able to do anything essentially that a rabbi could. And it's an interesting place now where we're trying to kind of reevaluate the overlap and separation between the roles of rabbi and cantor, because cantors are more and more expected to do everything that a rabbi does. Rabbi Aaron is incredible and has been the most amazing mentor I could possibly ask for in this, which is my first internship. These last 2 years have been my first time really doing this kind of work in a regular capacity. And he's given me so many opportunities. I give sermons, I lead Torah study, I get to do things like this, But then the question is, like, what is it that a rabbi does that a cantor doesn't do? Generally speaking, their education involves more text study and more study in halakha and Jewish law. I don't really know what happens if you find a bunch of figs that might belong to someone else, but probably Rabbi Aaron does. There's probably a Jewish law about that. Yeah, I think it makes a difference if the figs are in a circle or not. I don't know. Rabbis are weird, but but yeah, it's really interesting, and I think that this is something that is developing, and we're actually in a process right now of reevaluating our curriculum for both rabbinic and cantorial training, and I'm interested to see if it will allow for more flexibility and overlap. Rabbis are often expected to sing. I think Rabbi Aaron will be the first to tell you we're all very happy he didn't today. He's very he's very good at so many things, and he's the first one to say he's really glad that there's someone else there to do the singing.
So is that how it's divided up in a service? You would lead anything that was in song?
More or less. There have been, for example, Rabbi Aaron's wife Emily is also a rabbi, and I've led a service with her, and she sings beautifully. So because of that, sometimes we'll both sing, we'll lead duets together, and because of that, maybe I have more flexibility to do more talking, so it doesn't feel like, you know, and so there can be a lot more flexibility with that, depending on the team and the agreements that are made within that clergy partnership.
So do most Reformed congregations have both a rabbi and a cantor? I mean, you seem to have affiliation with several in the bio, and
Yeah, so those affiliations are more or less things that I've been doing through my work in school, except for Reformed Congregation Knesset Israel, which is my home synagogue, where I worked as a staff singer in the choir for a long time, and then came on as a cantorial soloist, which is what we usually refer to, what we usually use to refer to a cantor who's not a cantor, someone who's leading in the capacity of cantor, but isn't an ordained cantor.
So is that what
Cantorial
Dr.
soloist.
Cohen was?
I believe so.
Because
Yes.
he's a dentist.
Yeah. Well, and you know, many of us go into this as second careers,
Okay.
and so you know, there are also possibilities that you know you could have been a dentist and now you're a cantor, and there are you know ways to be ordained. A lot of cantors will also get really upset if somebody who's not ordained calls themselves a cantor because like go to school for 5 years for this. Yeah.
Is the cantor always a full-time position or is sometimes part-time?
It is when it's done right. It's a full-time position. When it's done right, it's a more than full-time position.
Yeah.
You're on call for everything and anything. But there are also synagogues that, for example, will have 3 cantors and 5 rabbis, and you know maybe you're rotating. There's a synagogue in New York that has a cantor who is beyond ready to retire, and she has moved to Florida. And she comes in once a month, and they got a student cantor to work 10 to 15 hours a week and try to make up the rest of that time. And then they hire other tutors, and they try to fill in the blanks with other people. And there are plenty of synagogues that only have a rabbi, and there are some that only have a cantor. There are musical rabbis, and there are cantors who are maybe better than others at, you know, the other kinds of stuff that we have to do. Leading a congregation, which, you know, is a lot. There are a lot of aspects to it, and yeah.
So how many in your program are women versus men?
Yeah. For a long time, it was very much male heavy, weighted, and right now it is very much the opposite.
Oh.
Part of that, I think, is because for a long time it was harder for women to be accepted. I'm actually meeting tomorrow with the first woman who was ordained as a cantor, Barbara Ostfeld. And it was really only like 50 years ago that she was ordained. And there were women who were serving as cantors or cantorial soloists before that, but the ordination wasn't happening. And they were allowed to study and get like a certificate or something, you know. And so then after that there was, you know, still some confusion of like, well, okay, are you going to be treated well if you do this? And are you going to get a job if you do this? You know, the men would be like, oh, you're fine, yeah, you're great, it'll be fine. And like, it was, you know, then you apply for a place and they're like, well, what happens if you get pregnant? Yeah, I know.
I mean, there are some points in pregnancy when it's hard to sing.
Yeah. But I mean, you know, like, what if like, they don't want to like worry about maternity leave or things like that, you know? And but like these were the things that they were dealing with, and so now it's a lot safer for women to be cantors. I'll also say this year, the 5th year class that's getting ordained, there are 11 students being ordained. 1 of them is male. Trying to do my math right. Hold on. 1 of them is male. 6 of them are one of them is male. 6 of them are female. Am I doing this right? Gosh, this is so embarrassing. 7 of them are female, and 3 of them are non-binary.
Okay.
And we're really lucky. 1 of them is coming to Temple Emanuel to take on the full-time position of cantor next year. So they will be officially the first trans non-binary students, cantors, ever ordained. And so that's a really exciting thing for them and for us and for the school and for Temple, who acted fast and can claim being the absolute first place to ever hire a trans non-binary cantor ever in anywhere. So really, really cool. Yeah, so right now in my class, I'll say my class is tiny. And part of that is because we started in 2020.
Yeah,
You know?
Yeah.
But also there is a real, it's a lot of work. I mean, this is something, you know, we find that callings to clergy life it's a lot. And there are a lot of things to consider. And it's not for everyone, and that's okay. My class right now is 4 students. I am among 3 women and 1 man. And we're very close, and I'm very grateful for it. It's not always the case. But yeah, they're incredible. Do you have a question, or did I?
Yeah, my question was, in our tradition right now, 60% of clergy are women, so more than half. I don't know what we would do without female clergy. But when I started ministry 20 years ago, there was more clergy than there were churches.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's quite the opposite.
Yes, same.
We can't get enough clergy. Is that the same?
Yes,
Okay.
it is. And, you know, and there are issues with, you know, membership as well. You know, we're losing that in, you know, and it's important that we move with the times. Also, Temple Emanuel is doing really well, and it's a testament, I think, to Rabbi Aaron's commitment to accessibility and just continual learning and development and meeting the needs of a changing community. But that said, like, even with the most dedicated clergy, it doesn't always work so easily, and it's complicated. There are many factors. There are financial elements. Is it safe to be in community elements? Is it, you know, what are our priorities? Are our children able to go to Hebrew school and soccer practice? Like, you know, it's very tricky, but we are finding, I'll say this, I am not worried about getting a job.
Is it more
Yeah.
likely to be in a reformed as opposed to a conservative congregation?
Yes, so that's very interesting. I am being ordained as a Reformed cantor, and my school is training me more or less in Reform practice, Reform music. There are differences in, for example, how we chant Torah. We didn't even talk about chanting Torah. There are differences in how we chant prayers. There are differences in the liturgy. That said, I got poached out of the Reform placement process just a few weeks ago after I leave Temple Emanuel. This is very silly, and I don't know if this will make any sense to you, but there's this superstar Israeli cantor who works at Park Avenue Synagogue, and he was going around the internet for non-Jewish people as well for a while. He did this Adon Olam to a Hamilton song, and it was this big, like, big thing, and got really fit. But anyway, he's incredible, and he reached out to me and asked if I would audition there, and he's just kind of, like, Park Avenue is a big enough and famous enough synagogue that even though it's conservative, my school was like, yeah, go for it, like, okay. So I will be learning a lot of conservative trope and prayers, and it's going to be a really steep learning curve, but their current intern is incredible and has offered to help me with so much, and she's got prayer books already, like, she's writing out all the solfege in the prayer books so I can chant out of the books, and but it'll be a lot. And so theoretically, after I graduate, after I'm ordained, I could work in a conservative synagogue. In fact, I was also work in a renewal synagogue or reconstructionist synagogue. But yeah,
What does that mean?
sure. So it's just different kinds of denominations. Like we would have Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Lutheran, and so some of them are more minor differences than others. Some of them are a matter of progressivism. Renewal and reconstructionists go a little like further in the flexibility of things than Reform. Conservative is, you know, more in the traditional realm of things, and then of course there's Orthodox. Yeah, so on this spectrum, we've got Orthodox, conservative, Reform, renewal, reconstructionist, kind of just.
I'm interested in the liturgy is so
Yeah.
different.
Yeah, well, a lot of it is just quantity. You know, we cut a lot in Reform stuff. And not just like prayers, but like entire services, just cut them. So there will be services that I'll get to do in the conservative synagogue that I will have never heard these prayers in my life. Some of it is because they're prayers that are problematic for Reform audiences, and the Reform congregants are not comfortable with that language. Certain things about chosenness, for example. Particularism versus universalism. Reform is very much more in a universalism area. So the reality is, while I'm so excited to learn so much at this place, and the resources they have are incredible, and I'll have experiences I couldn't have anywhere else, Reform is where my heart lies. And I would be hard-pressed to take a job in a conservative synagogue, because for me, again, it's that idea of informed choice that means something to me, and that I have authority to make those decisions about how I connect to the divine and to my identity and to my community. Yeah.
So was your family musical growing up, and like what led you on the path to go towards being a cantor versus using your gift in maybe a more secular kind of way?
Well, I would love to answer that question. I also realize it is noon, and if people have to go, please, I won't be offended. But that's a question that's dear to me. So my family is musical. My parents were in a band together. It's very cute. My mom does not read music, but she would write songs, and they would play her music because she couldn't read anyone else's. So but she's incredible. She's a beautiful singer. My dad plays guitar and also sings, and we have some old recordings of them singing together. And he still plays guitar a lot. He started a weekly jam with our neighbors, and now I'm desperately trying to learn guitar, and I try to come to the jam sometimes, and it's very sweet and wholesome. We've led Havdalah together on Facebook Live sometimes for Temple Emanuel. But yeah, when I was 7, I went to one of my cousins' bar mitzvah, and I heard the cantor sing, and it was like the first time I'd heard like a real Hazan cantor singing with all the movements and ornaments and we call it the krecht, the cries, when it kol nidre kind of stuff where it's like, oh. And I was like, I want to do that when I grow up. My grandfather said girls can't be cantors, and I was like, it wasn't true. It wasn't true at the time even, but yeah. So I tabled that, and really I never went back to it, not because I was a girl, but because I felt like I wasn't Jewish enough, because I hadn't gone to Hebrew school and I didn't know my Hebrew letters. And it felt like this gate that was shut to me without knowing how to read Hebrew, how to read these characters that were just this secret code keeping me out of a tradition that I felt a call to, but I didn't have the key to that door. And so, yeah, when I was 26, I was just about to age out of the birthright program, where you can go to Israel on a free trip, or for a nominal fee. They pay for your flight, and they take you to all these beautiful spaces, and I was like, I've been meaning to reconnect with my Jewish identity for so long, or connect for the first time in many ways. So I went to Israel. I wanted to go on a soul trek trip, and it was full, and they kicked me out of it. So they put me on a graduates and young professionals trip. And I was at a point in my life where I was working as a professional singer, mostly in choirs, a lot of churches, some secular choirs, and one synagogue choir at Knesset Israel. And I hated it. I hated singing. I was about to give up music entirely. I was looking into going back to school for anything. I was so unhappy, and my anxiety was at an all-time high. And I was just miserable. And I had a terrible graduate school experience in music, and I was about ready to hang it all up forever. So I go to Israel, and we go to Tzfat, the mysticism capital of Israel. And we look at some beautiful art and talk about music and this and that. And then they say, we're going to have a reaffirming or B'nai Mitzvah ceremony on Masada, on this historical landmark in the desert in Israel. And anyone who wants to reaffirm their Hebrew name or take a Hebrew name, if you don't already have one, is invited to do that and be recognized as an adult in the Jewish community. And I'm like, yes, oh my gosh, this is what I want. This is what I've been waiting for. And then I realized I have to choose a name. And that's a big deal. Like, names are important. So I went up to the guy that was organizing the event, and he was there with his 12-year-old son. And I said, this is really important to me. I talked through it. I made sure, that I could do all of this with full integrity, and that I was not agreeing to anything that didn't align with my own values. And then I said, well, now I have to find a name. And they both go, oh, we have suggestions for you. I'm like, okay, people I just met. Sure. And they both suggest Shira, which means song. And when I tell you, my stomach flipped over, my heart started pounding, and I was like, and so I really thought about it a lot. I called my parents, and we had this long talk, and I said, I think I'm going to do this. And, the day before, we go up to Masada. We're staying in these Bedouin tents. And I had become really close with this cohort of people that I was traveling with. I was so lucky that I got kicked out of the Soul Trek trip because the people who were in this group were so incredible. One of them lives in Pittsburgh. I have to see her. It's crazy. And she gives me this note. She folds it up into a little tiny thing and says, here, open this when the time is right. So we sing and dance, and we're doing all this great stuff in the tents. We wake up the next morning, and we're climbing up Masada, and I'm like, the time is right. And I open this note, and it says, I don't know if you will find all of the answers that you are looking for right here, right now, but I know that you are in the right place at the right time, and that your voice is healing, and you are a beacon of light. And if you follow your passions, you will find everything you're looking for. And I went up to Masada, and I said, in front of these people I just met days ago, for so long I felt like my voice wasn't my own, and that I had lost my voice. Maybe I never had it in the first place. And here with you all taking the name Song, I feel like I finally have found my voice. And gosh, the poor guy who gave me the suggestion is crying, and I'm crying. And so I get home from this trip, and I'm like, time to dive into Jewish life. Still no idea I wanted to be a cantor. Still felt like that was off the table. But I start volunteering for my synagogue and getting more involved in going to services that I'm not singing in. And I start giving rides to one of the altos who shouldn't be driving so late at night anymore. And we have a reason to just be going together. And then the cantor had a last-minute thing. She couldn't be there. She says, hey, will you sub in for me on Friday night? Yeah, bucket list item. Wanted to do this since I was 7, for sure. And so I came and I sang, and I'm still a person who gets a lot of anxiety singing, but I used my mantra, which is you don't have to love the sounds you're making. You just have to love the people you're singing to. And I looked out at that congregation and was like, gosh, that's so easy. So easy to love. And I said, I'm just going to communicate peace and comfort. And the singing was fine. And after the service, the organist, who was a friend of mine, said, there's a 45-minute lecture after this service before the oneg, before the Jewish coffee hour. And I'm going to peace out, because you can too, your job is done. And I said, Cantor Amy would stay. She would stay, and she would talk to everyone. And she would make sure that they felt heard and seen, because the job's not done. And this is not just a singing job. And I stayed, and I'll tell you, the singing was fine, but that time at the oneg, the reception of sorts, was life-changing. And I had people come up to me and say things like, my husband passed last month, and your voice and your presence on the bima gave me my first chance to heal. And someone said, I can't sing, but when you sing, I feel like I'm able to sing through you. And it was everything I'd ever wanted music to be and hadn't been experiencing. I went to my car and I cried for 20 minutes. And then I found the cantor that week, and I said, I can think of nothing else, and I don't know what to do about it. I don't know what this means, but I feel like if I don't do more of this, I will die. My body is screaming I don't know what to do. And she said, you could do this. And then I found out that the program that I was about to start applying to, I had started learning my alphabet, started learning my Hebrew, and I found out that the program did not allow students who were in committed relationships, committed long-term relationships with non-Jewish partners. And I was. 10-year-long relationship with a non-Jewish partner. He was willing to convert, and that was really uncomfortable for me, because I knew it wasn't for the right reasons. And, you know, we are not an evangelizing faith. I couldn't understand why they were demanding that. And I started to doubt if this was what I should do. So I went to Rosh Hashanah, our New Year service. I was singing in the choir and leading some extra things, and I prayed in a way that was like not how we think Jewish prayer works, but I did it anyway. And I was sitting there during the silent prayer, and I said, you know, I know this isn't how this works, but I could really use a sign. I could really use a sign right now. Like, this is the path that I should be on. And I opened my eyes to the temple president saying, the theme of this year's High Holidays is finding your Jewish voice. And I was like, okay. And I applied to HUC. So, and it's been the most fulfilling work I could have ever imagined. I mean, it's everything that I love, and I feel so lucky every day to be doing this work, and I can't wait for the ability to do it full time. But even the process of learning is so valuable and incredible. And to be doing it with my cohort, who is just astonishing. Just some of the best people I've ever known, and people who give me hope in a future of goodness, you know. So very, very lucky, and have been so lucky to have been here in Pittsburgh for these last couple of years for my internship working with Temple Emanuel, and getting to work here with you guys. And Anne has been amazing, and the choir is just so wonderful and welcoming, and yeah, it's just been a real treat.
All right.
Now
Thank you
it's
so
time.
much.
Thank you.